Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your hosts, Chris Jennings and Dr. Mike Brazier.
Thanks for joining us. We have part 2 of our discussion with Kevin Cry, Waterfowl Program Leader for Texas Parks and Wildlife. And I'm again joined here in studio by my co-host, Chris Jennings. Chris.
Hey.
And on the phone by Kevin Cry. Kevin, thanks for spending some more time with us.
Absolutely.
We're going to jump right in and pick up on some of the topics that we spoke about on the last episode, filling in some additional gaps that we didn't cover in as much detail. And so as we talk about these shifts in bird distributions, duck distributions, or goose distributions, obviously that's something that your hunters and your constituents are going to react to. And you, as the waterfowl program leader, are the person that they interface with on many occasions. So I know if we were to go to the east and talk to your counterpart, Larry Reynolds, he would talk about how people are and other states as well, how people are really frustrated and they're trying to look for explanations as to what's going on. And of course, Texas has a wealth of data, and there are some fairly stark contrast or fairly stark patterns occurring across the Texas landscape that help us understand what's going on, or at least speak to what we think is going on. So what do you hear, like, especially among your coastal hunters, which are the ones that are really seeing the change in bird numbers on the decline? What's their reaction? Are the patterns on the landscape stark enough that they're able to really see what's happening, or is there still some uncertainty in their mind as well?
It's really depending on where they're at, where do you set your feet to go hunting type of scenario. When you look at the Gulf Coast, going inland, and then you obviously follow the Gulf Coast, it's very, very different. Yes, people are feeling those impacts without question. Southeast Texas marshes are just not what they used to be. And bird abundance and visitation to that part of the world is just not what it used to be. We don't detect mallards in that landscape anymore. It's driven by shovelers and teal and gadwall. And yeah, there's real frustrations at times. Most of those guys that hunt that landscape, and even throughout most of the Gulf Coast, they're kind of either in a club or they have a blind, and it gets real frustrating. Hoping that birds come to your spot, your postage stamp on the landscape consistently, not only throughout the season, but year after year. And these birds are simply responding to declining habitat conditions, and two, pressure in those landscapes. They're getting wise to us, if you will. There's nowhere that we don't know they can go. We have better camouflage, we have better decoys, we have better boats, we have better, utility vehicles. We have everything. Google Earth. These birds are now responding to that. And so, yes, they're very much aware. But there's still some great, great, great places throughout the entire Gulf Coast ecoregion. And there's just some great examples of people that are doing an incredible amount of work very actively managing wetlands and water. They're putting their club members or clients on consistent, successful hunts, breaking records, most years because of all the work they put in throughout the summer. And so this idea that ducks are trained to go somewhere really kind of falls apart if you build it and you build it properly, ducks still come. And that's just been proven time and time again. And so for people that are willing to do the work, they're doing great. It's not cheap. I mean, obviously not everybody can do it. And so it can get frustrating for those, especially the public duck hunters that are, restricted to such small pieces of landscape with a growing number of people wanting to participate in that area. So yeah, it's being felt.
I guess the nature of my question was more specific to, my thinking was that if there's any place where people would be able to visually see what's happening to the landscape, it's probably some of the regions of the Texas coast. And I'm really thinking about that area around Houston. Having traversed that Houston metropolis numerous times, it takes at least 60 minutes on the interstate to get from one side of Houston to the other, and probably even farther now. And Houston is expanding westward into some of the historic rice ground, and so you can see right before your very eyes the loss of that important waterfowl habitat. And so I guess that was the nature of my question is, are those people that are able to see it on a daily basis sort of more accepting, and is it easier for them to realize some of the driving factors of it? And it sounds like probably for some of them it is, but others probably still don't, or just and it's just natural to be frustrated. I get that.
Yeah, it's a real hard pill to swallow when you grew up in the Katy area and knew what that was like 30, 40 years ago, and to drive that same landscape today. Obviously, visually, it's a change, but it's now replaced with buildings and houses and factories and giant distribution centers. And so, yeah, that's extremely frustrating for people that knew what it was. And it's being felt throughout the Gulf Coast, especially when you start talking about things like snow geese and white-fronted geese. That landscape is, nothing like what it used to look like. And changes are happening daily to that landscape, such that, it's continuing to deteriorate, if you will, in much of it. But there's still some great examples of people doing good things, but unfortunately, it's just kind of a small pocket of what used to be there.
Yeah, Kevin, that kind of leads me to my question. I've hunted down along the Texas coast quite a bit, everywhere from, Seadrift and down all the way. I hunted Baffin a couple of years ago. Last year, I went down to El Campo doing some teal hunting. But, a lot of those guys that I've hunted with down there, some of the old heads, I guess you could say, some of the older guides who have been around for a while, they all cut their teeth guiding snow goose hunts in that area. And they all talk about, the heyday. And growing up in Indiana, I even had friends who traveled down to South Texas to snow goose hunt. And I was always fascinated with the fact that, they did it, and snow geese in general, but kind of talk about how that whole game has changed and why. I mean, those geese are not showing up in massive numbers like they used to. And why is that?
Well, it's a very multifaceted answer, to be honest with you. But there are some really key things to note in this conversation. And then probably the most important thing that obviously Mike has lots of experience with is the lack of carrying capacity. The carrying capacity difference from 40 years ago to now is dramatic. We have deficits on the landscape right now for ducks and geese along that landscape. Houston moving west, like we just talked about, has put its footprint on top of what used to be some of the best goose wintering habitat in North America. Like you said earlier, people came from all over the country to come hunt light geese. We invented the game. They call them Texas rags for a reason. We invented snow goose hunting pretty much across the board, and we got really, really good at it. And it was a very important economic feature in that landscape. Every little town had a picking shed. Every little town had somewhere you go take your birds, get cleaned. There's still hunting lodges, many of them abandoned, strewn all across that landscape. That I just kind of get sad when I drive by. Don't have any geese nearby. And probably one of the biggest changes back in the late 90s. You kind of just see the moment that it happened when goose numbers started to decline, which is interesting because when you look at our goose population data, now mind you, again, midwinter data, one snapshot in time, not capturing all the ingress and egress of birds coming and going, but 60s, 70s, 80s were not our highest abundance. It was actually mid to late 90s when we had our highest numbers, at least according to our index. And then we really saw a dramatic change. Yes, it actually correlates just to visual eye very, very closely to the liberalized regulations. 98, 99, that's when we started seeing our decline. But that's also when we started seeing a real interesting shift in human behavior on the landscape. historically, that landscape was tied up by a handful of outfitters that did all kinds of cool management, including setting aside sanctuary and roost ponds. And it wasn't, it was just a handful of people had access to it. And then all those people would come in and they'd take them hunting. It was about that point that duck hunting really began to influence that landscape. Instead of having all these ponds set aside for geese and goose hunting in the rice fields and duck hunting being something you did while goose hunting, it just literally changed overnight to where everybody wanted to go duck hunting and started building duck ponds and putting blinds out. And that change in hunter behavior had great impact on goose numbers itself. When you correlate that to declining carrying capacity, we started seeing those falls. Almost every square inch of that prairie, and even closer down to the coastal marsh, was now being hunted, but for ducks. When historically that was not quite as popular, if you will, technique. And so these birds now went from having people that really, really cared about them and kind of kept care of them all winter long and made sure that they had a welcoming spot to be. All those places now have duck blinds on them. And that really began to see our decline. You correlate that further on down the road with what we talked about earlier with the drought of record and curtailment of irrigation water and loss of rice acres. That's just continued, wounding, if you will, to the overall big picture. And that brings us up to, this last few years, some of the lowest counts we've had, ever in our survey. The survey goes back to the 60s. And, the coastal mid-coast, the southern mid-coast, 59 south to the Gulf Coast itself, had the lowest count we've ever seen. There just weren't birds along that coastal marsh zone like we used to see. There's still some really good pockets, some good landowners, people doing some really good things, in the traditional area of Garwood and Eagle Lake, and a number of other different places in there that we still see birds. But like you said, it's nothing like what was there. One of my favorite exercises is to go back and look at historical imagery on Google Earth. Go back in time. You start pulling up black and white imagery of all kinds of reaches. Western Houston, deep parts of Calhoun County, southern Matagorda County, and you start looking at those pictures, and the entire landscape was rice. The entire landscape, and you're just like, wow, look at this, And you fast forward to current day imagery, and it's it's a number of things, and it's not rice. It could be turf grass, it could be cotton. It's just a number of things, and that's just not there, and it's driving it. So you look at the combination of hunting a landscape much differently to declining carrying capacities, declining resources. It's basically rolled out into the perfect storm of how to essentially not attract geese to the Texas coast anymore.
That's a great exercise for anyone to do, anyone that cares about waterfowl, really all across North America. If you want to see how dramatically a landscape can change, a landscape that was historically before human settlement and even into human settlement, European settlement of the area, how it can change in a way that fundamentally alters its usefulness for waterfowl. I encourage everyone that hears this to go spend 20, 30 minutes. And if you start out committing 20 or 30 minutes, chances are you're going to be there an hour to do exactly what you just described, because that area around Houston, and I think maybe east of Houston, but certainly west of Houston into the Texas mid-coast, is one of the few areas where you can find historical imagery dating back to the 30s that's on Google Earth. It's some black and white imagery that I think was obtained by maybe some of the early oil and gas exploration. I guess it would have been oil exploration at that time in that region, and it's been, at least that's my assumption, it's been my understanding of the source of some of that imagery. But you look at the historical prairie wetlands that occurred. There's still numerous areas in that black and white imagery where you will see these natural depressions. But then there's also hundreds of thousands of rice acreage that you talked about as well back in the 30s. And then you do that, move the slider forward to see what it is now, and there's your answer. In terms of how the landscape has changed. And I mean, that's really a neat piece of imagery that can show without question what has happened to the landscape. And it's continuing, as we kind of talked about with Houston moving westward there. So you can't have those things and not think that it's going to impact waterfowl populations.
The Ducks Unlimited Expo, May 15th, 16th, and 17th, 2020 at the Texas Motor Speedway in Fort Worth, Texas. Interactive villages, shooting, archery, dogs, fishing, kayak, canoe, 4x4 off-road tracks, ATV, UTV track, industry experts, demonstrations, exhibitors, and more. The Ducks Unlimited Expo, everything outdoors. The ultimate playground for the outdoor enthusiast. The Ducks Unlimited Expo. Visit www.duckexpo.com.
Another thing I want to say here about the goose trends on coastal Texas, when we're talking about explaining phenomena of nature, whether it be wildlife or natural resources, or whether it be in the human medical field, sort of one of the gold standards is sort of like a randomized treatment control experiment. You can get into the medical field and talk about double blind and all that kind of stuff. But really what you want to have is like a randomized treatment control experimental approach. We rarely get that, or we don't get that at a landscape scale. It's not like we have another Texas where we can go and do a treatment and a control. So a lot of times what we do, as you've alluded to, is just look for correlation. And there are few examples of what you would just kind of look at on the surface and say is a very strong correlation between the occurrence of liberalized regulations, the Light Goose Conservation Order in the late 1990s, and that decline of goose abundance on coastal Texas. It's not to say that's the only factor driving it. The other thing that was happening, though, you've talked about this also, is longer-term decline in rice acreage. If you look back in the 70s, rice acreage on the Texas coast was 500,000 acres. Well, so what's also important to know about rice agriculture on the Texas coast is that for every acre of planted rice in a given year, there's at least one, in many cases, two additional acres that were fallowed. There's this 2-year or 3-year rotation historically in Texas, and I think it's largely still practiced. So if you had 500,000 acres of planted rice, that meant you had somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million acres of unplanted rice, which most often was just kind of left fallow. That's not to say that was important goose habitat, but it's at least area that's not disturbed or not plowed or not developed, whatever. A lot of land out there that geese could distribute themselves across. And then by the late 90s, you're looking at planted rice in the Texas coast of somewhere shy of 300,000. And of course, it's gone down south of 200,000 now. So you're losing hundreds of thousands of acres of rice from that landscape. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'm pretty willing to bet that you did not see a similar decline in the number of hunters and the amount of hunting pressure. So what you have is a declining habitat base, but a somewhat constant hunter base and similar amount of pressure, you might say, and you're squeezing all of that into a smaller area. So you've kind of got a magnification effect on there. And like I said, that's not a treatment control experimental type of approach, but certainly a lot of correlation going on there. And it's so the other thing I just wanted to point out, a lot of other things happened in the late 90s. I know there are some groups out there that will point to a certain piece of legislation as a big reason for some of the things that were happening. I'm not going to let us be the ones that ignore that and as a way to give them fuel for some conspiracy. But that has nothing to do with kind of what we're seeing here. There were a lot of other things that happened in the late 90s. The emergence of spinning wing decoys also came about. Mud motors really came about and began to give greater access to all the areas that waterfowl occupy. There are a host of other things, landscape scale changes that really occurred, that coincidentally or otherwise happened in the late 90s, and it's really unfortunate. There was that confluence of changes in those few years, because it really does challenge our ability to tease out any of those things.
Yeah, and it kind of plays into when you had Ray Alasauskas on, and he talked about that. That's kind of the same time frame when that light goose population exploded so exponentially, in their breeding grounds, that Ray kind of mentioned and that these colonies started intermingling. And so, the chance of, these birds all coming back to one spot or coming back to a specific, and they started getting a lot more opportunistic. They started looking at some of these, probably looking a little deeper into some of these factors, the hunting pressure, the rice abundance, things like that. And when these different colonies came together, there's a potential. It's just another variable that you could add in there.
So the late 90s kind of, I like to call the time we declared war on the snow goose. As a continent, if you will. We declared war on this bird for a number of different reasons. And when that happened, initially, there was only one state ready to deal with it. And that was us. We're the ones that invented the game. We were very, very effective, and we went out and we enjoyed it. We enjoyed it for 2 or 3 years. Birds got wise to us real quick. It went from somewhere around just shy of 30,000 participants in the conservation order in Texas. The lion's share obviously be on the Gulf Coast. To most years, we barely break 1,000 people playing in the game anymore in Texas, just because we don't have that opportunity. That opportunity is elsewhere, and obviously we're all aware of where that's taking place and how it's exploding. But the reality is the war on snow geese made them break the rules. Snow geese are breaking the rules of what they used to do and why they used to do things. They're in bigger and bigger and bigger, more organized concentrations, staying further and further north. Like I said earlier, sitting, not batting an eye, sitting on 60, 70, 80 feet of water, as long as there was somewhere to fly out and eat food, and be organized. The more eyes, the better. So when these birds are being hunted, and hunted hard, very effectively, with all kinds of new gadgets and decoys and you name it, from Peace River, Alberta, all the way to the Texas and Louisiana Gulf Coast, they're wise to us. There's not a goose hunter out there that doesn't know how hard it is to shoot a snow goose, especially when you're coming off 3 and 4 and 5 years of very, very poor production. So now you have this extremely old, smart flock that when they break the rules of, I'm no longer going to coastal Louisiana or coastal Texas, I'm talking marsh. They used to live in the marsh. They're now saying, I'm happy as can be to be around 200, 400,000 of my brothers and sisters sitting on a power plant lake in the middle of America and, surrounded by millions of acres of corn in every direction. Why would I go any further south? Indiana is a bigger goose state than Texas right now, snow goose. Illinois has more snow geese than Texas.
Oh, absolutely. I did a kind of a bonus episode last week with one of our migration editors, Jay Anglin. He lives in northern Indiana, and he spent like 3 or 4 days in southern Indiana, and he's calling me, and he's like, there's probably close to 1 million snow geese in southwestern Indiana right now. And that just goes to show you, but that's exactly what you described. There's a power plant lake. I won't even name the power plant, just not to give any information away. But but there's one there, and it is literally surrounded by tens of thousands of acres of cornfields.
Yeah.
And it's like, then those birds are just happy.
No, they are. And it's a strategy that's beneficial to them to be closer to the prairies and closer to their breeding grounds. They don't have to go as far. So when, this conversation about declaring war on the snow goose, maybe it's the same, especially the geese that historically went to the coastal marsh of Louisiana and Texas, they might have been wise to not declare war on them. We probably couldn't have controlled. Hunting wouldn't have had that impact if we would have just not liberalized we probably would still be in the same boat we're in. We would still have fewer snow geese on the Texas coast. There's no question. But the continued pressure on that bird, on the scale at which we're doing it, is having great impacts on their behavior and their distribution. And, sitting in 2 inches of water in a rice field is pretty rare anymore compared to what they're doing, elsewhere.
I remember when you guys in Texas were actually thinking about, reducing the bag limit shortly after you went into the light goose conservation order, and I don't know if y'all ever went through with that, but I remember that was one of the this conversation was happening 10, 15 years ago, probably 12 years ago. So the other thing that I'll point out here, I'm having my laptop with me, I'm looking at various graphs and share some data. The other thing and Kevin, I don't know if you are actually aware of the magnitude of these numbers. When we talk about the decline of planted rice acreage on the Gulf Coast, it has increased by an even greater amount in the area known as the Lower Mississippi Valley. That's basically the Mississippi Alluvial Valley of southern Missouri, Arkansas, and Mississippi, and into northern Louisiana. In the 1970s, collectively, across the alluvial valley of those four states, four states, Louisiana, Mississippi, four, I can't count. There was about 500,000 acres of planted rice in a given year. Now, Kevin, do you know what the number is now?
I want to say close to 2 million.
It's close to 2 million. So fourfold increase. And so that provides a lot of food. Now, we'll talk, I'm sure, at some point about how after harvest, there's not as much food in these rice fields as there used to be for a number of reasons. And, kind of all that aside, the other thing that is there with 2 million acres of rice is a lot of places for these birds to distribute themselves and get away from the pressure. And that's what they lost in Texas. When you go from 500,000 acres down to 200,000 acres or so, I mean, there's tenfold more acres of available rice on the landscape, or nearly so in the alluvial valley than there was on the Gulf Coast across a similar. Yep. Well, the Gulf Coast of Texas. But it's a fourfold difference between the Gulf Coast, Texas and Louisiana, and then the alluvial valley of those four states. So, and that matters. That matters.
It matters, and one of the things that's interesting is, because of our snow goose decline, like I said earlier, we changed our tactics. We went to become duck hunters on the Texas, prairie. There's a duck blind in every hole now. The MAV, that landscape, greenheads are the prize, right? And so when all those birds have moved out there, they didn't have, the people chasing them. And so I imagine snow goose hunting in that part of the landscape, especially in conservation order, is growing. I'm aware of a number of outfitters that used to be on the Texas coast that have moved to that landscape to go take advantage of those geese. But still, I suspect mallard is king there. And, they're not being pressured near as bad as, the Texas and Louisiana coast, where we got a duck blind every half mile. It seems like in some places. And so it was kind of welcoming. I mean, obviously you're talking about incredible amount of food, but then at the same time, they weren't being harassed that badly. And so why do we think it? Why are we surprised by it? I guess is what I'm trying to say. Why are we surprised that these birds are changing? It just so happens to be that the Arctic geese, white fronts, snow geese, and even small Canada, seem to be the most quickly adaptable. And so we're seeing it right before our eyes. We're seeing crazy things happen with white-fronted geese. We're seeing crazy things happen with small Canada geese. Obviously, incredible things happening with snow geese. And, it's kind of a unique time in waterfowl management to be able to see this happen. But the reality is, sadly, it's because of some of the things that we're doing, whether we're changing habitats on them and or, where they're encountering pressure. And they're doing it for a reason, and they got wings for a reason, and it's pretty awesome. I hate this idea of the vilification of a snow goose, people justifying heinous acts because we declare them overabundant. In reality, there's not many remaining species on planet Earth that are more awe-inspiring visually and audibly than huge concentrations of snow geese. I mean, you think about what my job is in the state of Texas, we might be one of the few people left in North America that really want them, and we want them back. And we're trying some things. We're doing some management changes. We're even looking at some regulatory changes because we want them. We like snow geese, and we want to continue that tradition. But elsewhere, they're kind of vilified. And I think they're one of the most magnificent species left on planet Earth, and in a lot of different ways. And so I like to celebrate them, whereas some places like to say, justify heinous acts to protect certain other areas of the planet. But I think they're an amazing bird, and here in Texas we're going to continue to do whatever we can. And we got some really cool new programs and potential regulatory changes coming. They kind of prove that we do care about them, and we got our fingers crossed. We know we're never going to get back, to the quote unquote heyday. That's an unrealistic goal, but it wasn't long ago, soon after the BP oil spill and a couple of really cool programs that went out on the landscape, that we were able to get our winter index above long-term average that 1 year, and that was because of those programs. And so my goal right now is to get back to long-term average and start putting habitat on the landscape, talking about sanctuary, talking about roost ponds, big picture stuff. And we're going to go see what we can do.
Yeah, I think one thing that I'm seeing, and I've snow goose hunted the last 6-7 years, Mississippi and Arkansas, pretty avid about it. One thing that we're seeing, and I hunt on, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but I hunt primarily east of Crawley's Ridge for snows during the light goose conservation order. And when you get on the other side of the ridge, the birds are very spooky, and I think they have a whole lot more pressure. And a lot of that has to do with the last couple of years, the duck hunting has been not exactly up to standards for some Arkansas hunters and outfitters. And so what they've decided to do, which is a complete change, because, 5-6 years ago, you'd never hear this, these duck outfitters who, pride themselves on greenheads, they're boosting their outfitter numbers by offering spec hunts in the afternoon. And they're doing this over white spreads. And it's very effective.
Specs are an awesome bird. They're doing quite well, and they decoy well. And so it's one of those things that mallard hunters and the MAB certainly taken a liking to, and for obvious reasons. And that's a great example of shift in distribution. But you got to ask yourself, to kind of get forward thinking here, how long will that last type of scenario? Because we didn't ask ourselves that 10, 20 years ago down here. How long will white fronts continue to endure that?
Yeah, and it's really impacting the snows, because by the time the light goose conservation order comes in, those snows they're so smart. Just like you kind of spoke to the fact that, they're so opportunistic and so adaptable and so quick to change. You're seeing that even by the time the light goose conservation order opens, these big flocks of snows are very, very aware of what people are trying to do with decoys, or they're shifting out early. Birds are moving a little earlier, and I think a lot of it has to do with it's pressure. It's definitely pressure.
Well, yeah, no. If there's ever a bird that is more directly correlated to running away from humans, it's them. and they've distributed themselves across the landscape very interestingly because of it, and they've organized. Like I said, we've seen snow geese do this for years, get bigger and bigger flocks, more and more organized. And that's what we're seeing with mallards too. We're beginning to see mallards turn into snow geese. Do very similar type of tactics, not spread out in little flocks across the entire landscape. They're all together in big, giant concentrations, all going out to the same field to feed, all coming back to the same pond to roost. We're seeing that very similar act. Those two species are breaking the rules as we speak right now. It can be very frustrating for the hunters. And I think that has a huge part of the frustration and dissatisfaction we have right now is this quick change in behavior in these birds.
Well, hopefully we get some good breeding conditions up on the prairies this year, and hopefully we get a lot of young, and in the Arctic as well this year, and we get a lot of young birds both on the mallard front as well as the goose front, and then hopefully that brings a bit a more inexperienced birds down the flyway the next few years. So that will definitely help. It's just a whole combination of factors that drive what happens throughout the flyway with these birds and their interactions with hunters. Kevin, we're going to bring this to a close. We have had a fantastic conversation with you, and we appreciate you coming on and sharing your expertise, sharing your data, and your passion for this resource. Anybody that's listened to this clearly can tell that you are definitely passionate about this resource, like so many of your other colleagues in state waterfowl biology. And we thank you for coming on. Thank you for joining us. And this, I can guarantee you, this will not be the last time that we'll have you on.
Excellent. I look forward to it, and it was my pleasure.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We extend a very special thanks to our guest on today's show, Kevin Cry, Waterfowl Program Leader for the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. We've had Kevin on for 4 episodes now, and I believe that gives him the distinction of holding the crown of the greatest cumulative length of discussion of any of our guests that we've thus far had on the podcast. So a special thanks to Kevin for sharing his time. Thanks to my co-host, Chris Jennings, for joining us here in studio, and our producer, Clay Baird, who does all the work getting these podcasts edited and out to our listeners. And, of course, our listeners, we thank you for your time. We thank you for your interest. We thank you for your comments and for rating the show. And most importantly, we thank you for your passion, commitment, and support of wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.